Hi, good evening. We're just going to wait for a few more people to join us before we get started.
Okay.
There's still people signing on. Going to give it another 30 seconds.
Sure.
Hi, good evening, and welcome to the live webinar that Dr. Felsen is going to be presenting on anxiety and other post-traumatic reactions in survivors of the Holocaust. So on behalf of Next Generations and the Now for Holocaust Survivors Initiative at Morse Life Health System, I welcome you to another of our live webinars. We have 69 registered this evening. My name is Jenny Frummer, and I'm the director of the Now for Holocaust Survivors Initiative, and I volunteer with Next Generations as their director of strategic initiatives. A few words about our host organizations. Next Generations is committed to educating all ages about the lessons of the Holocaust and to mitigating anti Semitism, bigotry, and hate by promoting respect and teaching the skills of being an upstander, not a bystander. We also are committed to supporting Holocaust survivors and their offspring, the second, third, and fourth generations, or the next generations of family members. We are obligated to support the authentic voices of Holocaust survivors and their families. The Now for Holocaust Survivors Initiative provides services to Holocaust survivors in Palm Beach County. We work with local organizations to expand services to Holocaust survivors and their families who live in Palm Beach. Regardless of the care a survivor may already be eligible to receive through the general grants from the Claims Conference allocated to Jewish Family Services, a survivor and their family member may receive additional services paid for by the Now initiative. A unique feature of this program is the vast array of services available through Morse Life, which includes familiar traditional community based and in home care services, as well as palliative care, hospice services in home and on site. Other critical services, such as respite care, rehabilitation, memory care, skilled care, assisted living, and independent living communities are also offered on the Morse Life campus. The Now initiative is fully embedded in a comprehensive health system at Morse Life, which is the premier organization providing services to older adults. This webinar series is partially funded by a grant from the Jewish Federations of North America and the Center for the Advancement of Holocaust Services, Survivor Care. All of our webinars presented by Dr. Felsen are live and have different specific topics, although there is overlap. We are grateful to you for sharing your extensive experience, Dr. Felsen, your insights, and your research in working with Holocaust survivors and their families. Just a few words before we proceed related to housekeeping. All participants in this webinar have your cameras turned off. You are also muted. We cannot see any of you on camera because we are in broadcast mode. We will not be able to hear any of you during the presentation or during the Q&A. Our webinar team consists of Dr. Felsen, myself, Rabbi Erica Rosenkrantz, who is now the Now Initiative's Director of Community Engagement, and our IT professional, support professional, Martine. If you wish to communicate with any of us, please use the chat feature at the bottom of the black bar or the Q&A icon also at the bottom of your screen. We have a few questions during this presentation. They will pop up as poll cards, and you just click on whatever response you want to make. And when we share the responses, if you want to remove the box, you just click on the corner at the top, the X. As for the format of today's webinar, Dr. Felsen will present for 55 minutes, after which I will facilitate a Q&A session for about 15 minutes. Please type your questions anytime during the presentation, and we will try and get to as many questions as we possibly can. Also, please note that you can change the view on your screen by clicking at the top on the right corner, and you can actually change the way you view the presenter and or the slides. The webinar will be recorded, but it will not be available until the end of the series. If you have requested or are interested in CEUs, please be in touch with me directly. Tomorrow you will receive an evaluation. I urge you please to respond. It won't take more than 2 or 3 minutes. And now what you've been waiting for is to hear from Dr. Felsen, whose bio is on the Next Generation's website. Want to welcome you all. I have a special shout out to colleagues from Jewish Family Services and also to those who are joining us from the network of Jewish Human Service Agencies. And now it gives me great pleasure to have our friend and my friend and colleague, your friend and colleague too, Dr. Irit Felsen. Thank you, Irit.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Thank you, Dr. Frumer, my friend and my colleague, and thank you all for joining us this evening. It has become a very meaningful part of my life, our Sunday meetings and our Tuesday meetings. And I really appreciate all the comments that I get from you, from some of you afterwards. I also just wanted to apologize and mention something before we start. I took out almost all the references from the slides because many of you asked me to do so that the slides will be a little bit easier to follow. And so if any of you wants the reference for a particular point made, you're welcome to ask me for it. So before we go into the topic of today, which will actually be anxiety and anxiety related responses in survivors and the second generation, we like to always know who is with us. So please, if you can fill out that first question, and then there will be 2 more following and none more. Okay. Great. Thank you very much. And we'll go to the 2 questions that we have for you in the beginning. And then we'll go into our presentation. Yes? Are we ready, Jenny, to go to the next one? Yes?
You should see it on your screen right now.
Yes. I don't see the poll yet, but
The poll is up, Dr. Felsen.
okay. For some reason, I'm not seeing it.
When we share the results, I'll let you know what they are
No problem.
in just about 5 more seconds.
Mm-hmm.
So 43% said yes to a significant degree. 32% said yes, very much so. And
So that puts us at 75% between yes, very much, and yes to a significant degree.
correct.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay.
And this is the last poll. Please click on all that apply to you. Okay, we're going to close this poll.
Yes.
And the results are being shared.
Good. So we're ready to go to the next and start our presentation now, right?
Yes, were you able to see those results?
Yes. I just wanted to, are people still able to see the results or no longer? They can?
Yes.
Right. So I just want you to see, this is a very good presentation of what you will hear me talking about, which is a fairly high level of anxiety and hypervigilance combined with or something that actually is manifested in a sense of competence and preparedness for whatever the worst that can happen, and a sense of being able to deal with this, being prepared to deal with this, and at the same time also an ability to enjoy oneself. Yes, feeling, being told by others, at least a third of you, that you're a little bit too tense, but that sense of competence that goes along with it, that sense of preparedness, that sense of resilience, we will talk more about the combination of these two, the hypervigilance and the competence and resilience that is associated with it, is very characteristic of many, many of us, and the way we feel about things. Okay, so let's see, I'm trying to go to the next one. Okay. So as some of you know, I usually like to start by sharing with you the only photograph that I have of my ancestors. This is the family of my father. There is no picture left of my mother's family. And this picture was taken and mailed to the eldest daughter who left Poland when she got married. And that's why the family put on their best clothes and posed and sent a picture, which survived the war. We will start by me sharing with you a quote, which I always thought is so beautiful, by Haikinen at the meeting of the World Health Organization in Geneva, who said, "The way in which we grow old and experience this process, our health and our functional ability, all depend not only on our genetic makeup, but also on what we have done during our lives, what sort of thing we have encountered in the course of our lifetime, on how and where we have lived our lives." And I think that that is a very beautiful way to start talking about anxiety reactions and other reactions in the descendants of survivors, by considering a little bit first, what did our parents encounter? What did they live through? All of them saw the extreme of evil and sadism, not only in Nazis, but also in others, in collaborators, in past neighbors, and in all kinds of enthusiastic opportunists in various times and situations during the Holocaust. Some of them also saw and came across the most courageous human beings. So Many of you are a little bit familiar of the concept of PTSD, which has become, unfortunately, something most of us are aware of in the general culture, not only amongst us, second generation. And the newest version of it has a little bit of a different emphasis than previous versions. And I will start by saying, first of all, that post-traumatic stress disorder is the only mental health disorder in our entire Bible of diagnoses, which we call the DSM. It's the only mental health disorder that requires, for its definition, for its diagnosis, a relationship to a specific event in external reality, an event which involved exposure to death or to the threat of death, to serious injury, or a serious witnessing a serious injury to someone else, or what we will talk about a little bit more, secondary exposure or secondary traumatization. And once somebody went through these kinds of circumstances, we know that many people develop a few clusters of typical reactions. One of them is the very well-known or relatively well-known intrusive phenomena. So the people are triggered, memories and fragments of memories are triggered by all kinds of reminders that one comes across. And these reminders can be imperceptible to other people. It can be a smell, a sound, as I showed in the previous meeting, the image of laundry hanging on the line in the street can be a trigger for someone who saw it who saw something very very traumatic that involved such a sight. So intrusive memories, intrusive thoughts, intrusive moods that come over one when one is triggered in this way, and nightmares and dissociative reactions where someone is really momentarily in a different place. Another cluster of very typical reactions is what we call avoidance. So trying to avoid any kind of situation that might be triggering. So avoiding certain stories, or avoiding the news, or avoiding people or conversations, or certain activities that might involve something that will trigger one. I'll jump for a minute to cluster E, which is the hyperarousal, which is also a characteristic chronic state of being sort of hyper aroused, irritable, jumpy, the sort of overreactivity to noises, to loud noises, to unexpected noises and movements, all of those things. And cluster D is the one that I highlighted here because that's the one that was added to the most recent understanding on and definition of post-traumatic reactions. And it's very relevant for survivors of situations such as the Holocaust. It is the recognition that there can be profound and pervasive changes in the way people think about themselves and about others and about the world. There can be amnesia for very important chunks of experience. There can be a change in beliefs about God, about oneself, about the goodness of people, all kinds of things, and changes in the feeling of being amongst other human beings, a detachment for others, a distrust, or a very constricted ability to feel all kinds of emotions, which we call constricted affect. And these things, which are highlighted in this most recent definition of PTSD, are important for us because they are the result of massive prolonged trauma, as opposed to the PTSD that someone might feel as a result of an accident or a single assault even, or something that is a one-time trauma. And many survivors of the Holocaust, of course, shared to some extent some of these symptoms. And here I just give you the example of the rates of PTSD that have been seen in a huge study that looked at more than 20,000 people across the world, survivors of all kinds of natural disasters and technological disasters, not man-made, not war, and not human violence. And you see that there is quite a high level of post-traumatic symptoms following such disasters, which are bad enough. But when the disaster is man-made, when it is the result of human perpetrated violence and intentional violence by some people against other people, then we know that in general, the levels of PTSD are much, much higher even than the levels of PTSD as a result of technological or natural disasters. Because when people do this to other people, there is a distinctly additional aspect that involves the fact that there was a malevolent intent, a total lack of empathy to the suffering of other human beings, an intention to hurt them, to cause pain, to torture, to maim. And that really goes deeply into our very basic beliefs about the world, shattering our beliefs about self, about others, about the world, about our place in the world. And people often say after such traumatic experiences that they do not feel that they are who they were before the trauma. Now, to give you a sense of what sometimes it's very important, since we really have not much data about assessing the symptoms in Holocaust survivors in the immediate time after the war ended. We learn a lot from what we see in other people who have been assessed very recently, relatively speaking. We learn a lot about what might have also been the situation there. So the ACE study is a series of studies of adverse childhood events. It was run in this country by Kaiser Permanente, the insurance company. They wanted to see what is the relationship between all kinds of adverse events in childhood and the physical and psychological health of people when they are adults. And so they included these categories of adverse experiences that you see in the slide, including substance abuse of the parents in the family or someone else close in the family, parental separation or divorce, mental illness of one of the parents, battered mother, criminal behavior in the family, and those 7 categories of abuse and neglect of the child: psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect, emotional and physical. And what the sample that was used was very, very large and representative of the general population in this country. And the findings were that about 60% of people from the general population reported that they had at least one of those events while growing up. And the number of categories that a person said they suffered from in childhood showed a very strong relationship to many, many later diseases as an adult, including just about every kind of an illness. And the categories, these different categories of adverse events, were strongly interrelated. So when people had multiple categories of childhood exposure, they had multiple health risk factors later in life. And just to give you some ideas, for example, people who had 4 or more of those categories of childhood exposure to these events had either between 4 times as much to 12 times as much increase in health risks for alcoholism, for drug abuse, for depression, for suicide attempts, and a lot of other increases, multiple times increases in the risk for many, many other things. So and that is, of course, trauma that was experienced in the family, in the home, the adverse childhood events. Now, we know that during childhood and adolescence, and we know from neuroimaging studies that we have at our disposal in the recent couple of decades, that actually stress induces changes in the brains of people with post-traumatic stress disorder. And such changes are often seen in the brains of people who suffered early and prolonged stress during childhood, of course, because it's such a time of transformation and development for the child's brain. So what we see in brains of people with PTSD is actually an increased level in a piece that is called the amygdala, which is essentially the alarm system of the brain. So it's an overactive alarm system that responds to a lot of signs of danger and is more reactive to signs of danger than it maybe ought to be, and a decreased activity in other parts of the brain that are very important for planning complex cognitive behaviors, complex operations, and making decisions, and social behaviors, and empathy and impulse control. Those parts actually show somewhat of a decreased activity. So think about the combination between an overactive brain, overactive to danger, and a somewhat decreased ability in all of these functions that I just named. And we also see neurochemical changes in people who have PTSD, including a bunch of things like increased dopamine levels, increased norepinephrine levels, and decreased serotonin levels, and all kinds of other things. I just brought those as an example. And all of these put together are associated basically with a higher level of what we call dysregulation, so overreactivity, too many things. And in another study, a very large study that was conducted by the World Health Organization, it was shown that when people were exposed throughout their lives, and this is again on samples across the globe, different types of traumas, but when people were exposed throughout their entire lifetime to more than 4 events that fulfill what we consider the criteria to be called trauma, those people who had more than 4 showed a much higher level of impairment and dysfunctionality in their lives after that. Now, we know as children of survivors that many survivors experienced many, many more than 4 such traumatic events. They probably experienced more than 4 in less than a day, every day of their life during the Holocaust. So surprisingly, they actually did not as a group show such impairment and dysfunctionality as was shown in the samples that the World Health Organization study showed. And it's really a remarkable finding, and especially when you remember that most survivors got no mental health assistance and no social recognition, and very little concrete pragmatic assistance in the early years after the end of the war. So the symptoms that we see in survivors, not only Jewish survivors, but also many, many others who were children during World War, persist for many, many years. And in a study that looked at more than 71 studies of Holocaust survivors in 2010, they were definitely very, very much more, they were clearly suffering from much more PTSD than other peers. And you can see the findings here. There's a little bit of an elevation in other areas, but very little. And in the middle, you see the 2 very high spikes that show that both survivors from what we call clinical samples, so survivors that received some mental health intervention, and those who never received any mental health intervention, both of these spikes were very, very high in post-traumatic stress symptoms 60 years after the end of the war. So most of us grew up with parents who had some significant level of post-traumatic stress disorder. Not all of us, but many of us. And what we see is that that is a very, very important mechanism in the transmission of susceptibility and sensitivity to stress reactions in the second generation. So parental mental health issues, and in particular, parental post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression are very important in the transmission of effects to the second generation. And some other parameters that I put up there as well, such as, of course, the way that we perceive the quality of parenting and the nature of the attachment that we were able to form with our parents. And it makes a very big difference if one had one survivor parents or two, especially if one had one parent who had some post-traumatic symptoms that persisted for a long time. Of course, it also matters if there are certain serious life stressors in the second generation's life, and we have evidence for genetic propensities or sensitivities that lead some people to have a greater likelihood of developing post-traumatic stress symptoms after a trauma, as opposed to other people with a different genetic makeup who might have gone through the same trauma. And we see it now in studies that look at recent survivors of trauma, such as survivors from Rwanda and from other places, and from combat trauma. We see that there is some evidence for that. And of course, there is also the psychobiological and epigenetic changes that we might talk a little bit more about. So important very much in the discussion of the transmission to the second generation is the issue of secondary traumatization, because we, the second generation, did not survive the Holocaust. We did not go through it, thankfully. We, to the extent that we have some effect related to it, are showing the effects of secondary traumatization. Living with a traumatized parent or a traumatized spouse constitutes a stressor that Charles Figley called compassion fatigue. So people who live with someone who they love and who they spend their lives with, or spend childhood, adolescence, or a spouse with such a person, might identify and internalize a lot of the trauma story and imagery that's related to the events that happened to their trauma-exposed father, mother, or spouse. And we see, in fact, in a study from Israel, that about a third of spouses of Holocaust survivors, spouses who themselves were not survivors, developed symptoms of post-traumatic stress. And just by living with the survivors. And we see the same in wives of Israeli veterans with PTSD and in the wives of American veterans with PTSD. And it's also obviously part of it is a result of the difficulty of living with someone who has PTSD, because that in and of itself is a stressful situation for many spouses. And couples in which one of the spouse suffers from PTSD, when we compare them, let's say veterans with PTSD and veterans without PTSD from the same combat theater, the ones who have PTSD, we see have many more marital difficulties than other couples with the same history of combat, but without PTSD. And of course, the level of marital stress that's related to the parental PTSD impacts very much the atmosphere in the family and is associated with often with behavioral problems in youth in the family. This is what we see in current samples, and that also tells us something about our own experiences. And how we understand this is that PTSD actually in many ways impacts the capacity of a parent to optimally parent their children. The symptoms of PTSD that I mentioned before, whether it's the hyperarousal, being so irritable, being so quickly overreactive, or the other cluster of detachment, of emotional detachment and numbing, each of them is seen in studies to be associated with, of course, impaired parenting and impaired experiences of parenting as described by the child. Children describe moments that were very important to them, especially positive moments in their lives where the where the parent with PTSD had a very hard time responding joyfully, participating as joyfully as the child would have wanted. And on the other hand, children describe oftentimes when the parent with PTSD responded disproportionately and in a way that could have been even hurtful or frightening to relatively minor events because they were so hyper aroused and irritable all the time. So what we see is very important to highlight is that it's not necessarily the exposure to the trauma itself that is primarily the primary mechanism in determining how much impact that has on the second generation, but rather the most important thing is how much the parent continues to suffer from trauma-related reactions and symptoms while they're raising their child. A parent who has more symptoms will probably impact the child more than a parent with a very low level of symptoms. So we talked about numbness and detachment, and I wanted to just mention here that one of the important things about numbness and detachment is that many times survivors had to anesthetize their feelings, or what somebody referred to as robotization of the self. It's a protective, extreme protective mechanism under circumstances that are just intolerable. And I bring you here the quote from a very close friend of my parents, who was a young boy, like 13 years old, when he was in the concentration camp. And he said to me, when he heard that I was doing my first research on children of survivors, he said, there is no such thing as transmission. I can tell you, because I can tell you that after you walk on human skulls for 3 days, after 3 days, you don't feel any different than if you were walking on stones. And he really meant it. And he didn't realize that what he was actually describing was the operation of this extreme defense mechanism of numbing yourself completely to what it is that is actually happening to you, because you have to if you want to survive. The problem is that many times this extreme mechanism is not fully reversible for people after the end of the trauma. So sometimes people continue to be very anesthetized to their own pain, which for the survivors themselves might have been adaptive in life after the war, because it helped them put aside the pain, not feel it, and be able to build their lives and go to work and function as very pro-social people, which is all in all the way the larger majority of Holocaust survivors functioned in the countries to which they immigrated. But at the same time, when people are very unempathic to their own pain and anesthetized to their own suffering and to their own emotional difficulty, to their own difficulty getting up in the morning and going to work after they didn't sleep in the night because they had nightmares, they sometimes are very unempathic also to the difficulties of their spouse or their children, normative difficulties and normative sort of challenges of normal development, which seem so small next to what they have been through. And because they are so anesthetized, they sometimes are experienced as very unempathic towards the children or their spouses. So this is a very beautiful book that I recommend. It's the book by Maria Doria Russell called A Thread of Grace, which describes the experiences of a young girl who spent her time during the Holocaust with the Italian partisans in the north of Italy in the mountains. And in the epilogue, which I translated from the Hebrew, so forgive me if it's not exactly this way when you read it in English, the rabbi, when she dies, tells eternal compassion, the cancer, the divorce, the miscarriage. In their mother's opinion, nothing of what happened in Canada can ever justify crying. Save your tears, she used to say, you might need them sometime. So that's one of the very beautiful depictions of that kind of the effects of numbing and detachment in the relationship. On the other hand, I'm sure many of us, my students don't necessarily know this movie, but I think many of us might remember the movie Born on the 4th of July, a very, very powerful movie. And I gave you this image here to also, on the other hand, after discussing numbness and detachment, talking about anger in PTSD, which is not one of the defining criteria for PTSD, but it often comes along when people have suffered a tremendous trauma and have post-traumatic symptoms. They can easily become much more, as we said, irritable. It's part of the hyperarousal. And in many people, it is also associated with discontrol of anger, disproportionate anger and rageful reactions, which often go along with PTSD. So think about it yourself. Are you more easily angered when you're anxious and when you didn't sleep well for 3 nights? For sure. Think about what survivors had to deal with when they didn't sleep well, most of them almost ever, or had to deal with their anxiety on a daily chronic level. So that's also part of what happens in the mechanism of transmission. Anger, parental anger, unpredictable anger can be very frightening, can be very disruptive to the quality of the connection between parents and children. And I recommend highly, and if we were in the same room, I would show you a snippet of a movie, which I don't think is a great movie, but it's a very good movie for the second generation to watch. It's called Fugitive Pieces. And there is a scene there where the child of a survivors is cuddling next to his father on the sofa. He's maybe 6, 7, 8. And the adults are talking in the living room, and he gets bored of the conversation and he puts down the apple half eaten that he was eating, and he wants to go play. And in a split second, this triggers his father and his father's memories of his starvation in the concentration camp. And you see the triggered father, who a moment before was very warm and very, there was such a nice feeling between him and his boy on the sofa. And you see him transform into this angry, frightening father. And you see the boy freeze with fear. And as the movie goes on, you also see the impact of it on the boy and on their relationship. So those things were very disruptive and very impactful for some of us who grew up with parents who had such moments. We also have to remember that while post-traumatic stress disorder is the most discussed and the most researched in relationship to trauma, there are many people who suffered not exactly from post-traumatic stress disorder as we would define it, because post-traumatic stress disorder is characterized by the hallmark cluster of symptoms, which are those intrusive memories and nightmares and all of that. And some people didn't have it. And what they had more was just the anxiety and the depression without the intrusive phenomena. But those two were plenty enough to impact the lives of the survivor himself or herself and the family relationship. So when we talk about our own propensity for anxiety, I will tell you, and here I will maybe skip a little bit in terms of the order of my slides, because I want to make sure that I get to say it. When I reviewed all of the research that I thought was of high enough quality in in 1998, it's still the largest review of the empirical studies of second generation to date. But I have reviewed also many, many doctoral dissertations and all kinds of, and it's consistent with newer studies. What we see is that we do not, as a group, show a higher frequency or a higher concentration of psychological disorders. We do have a small group, perhaps 13% of us or something like close to that, show the more severe symptoms that would fall under diagnosable disorders of anxiety and depression and PTSD. But most of us as a group do not show that. Most of us actually show just elevated levels of anxiety, elevated levels of tendency towards depressive symptoms, towards mistrust, towards feelings of alienation, towards a little bit of discontrol of our anger, whether over control, which is more typical amongst the women amongst us. So difficulty saying no, difficulty being assertive enough, difficulty setting boundaries in various relationships, even when someone angers us or doesn't treat us well, and under control of anger, meaning flying off the handle a little bit too fast, but not in the clinical level, just elevated levels of all of these, which essentially are signs of sensitivity to stress and to these depressive reactions. And what we see is that when we look at how we now age, because we are now the second generation enter our own aging, we see that those of us who describe their own parents as having had higher levels of post-traumatic stress symptoms, anxiety symptoms, depressive symptoms, those have a much less good perception of their own aging. So if we perceive our parent, at least one of them, to have had more post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, we have less good scores in our description, our subjective description of how we feel. We feel older than our chronological age. We feel that aging is a process of losses. And we also have much less good scores in our objective measures of aging, which have to do with the number of medications we take or the number of medical conditions we deal with. So post-traumatic parental reactions were really shown to be very much related to how we now perceive our own process of aging. And one of the hypotheses about how it's related to our own physical health, even as we enter middle age, one of the hypotheses is, of course, epigenetic changes. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about it in the question and answers period if we don't get to it in the presentation itself. But also because just living with somebody who causes us, if you like, it's a harsh way of putting it because it's not the parent's fault. But as I said, living with a parent who has a higher level of those symptoms is a stress in and of itself. And if you live with that stress chronically, it can lead to the child themselves developing maladaptive coping mechanisms and having themselves a chronic state of dysregulation of the stress response in the child's body, in the child's autonomic nervous system, which then, if it's chronically active then all the time, it creates a risk for diseases of various kinds, because being chronically hyperaroused, being chronically overreactive takes a very high toll on our physical health. And that was true for our survivor parents, and that is true for the second generation who have this level of secondary traumatization. So this is about my early study, my early review, and the other area in which we are different from others is the area of separation individuation, which I will just briefly mention here. But as my colleague and friend, Jenny, Dr. Frumer mentioned, there are connecting links between our different presentations. So I choose to focus more on certain issues in different presentations. And this issue is one that will be addressed in other presentations. So I will just briefly say that separation individuation is that process that both psychologically and geographically, physically, allows children to kind of grow apart from their parents as they mature, so that the mature young adult is not as interwoven and independent and dependent of the parents as they were when they were 6 years old. And so the separation refers to the more pragmatic and real, so to speak, distance that is put in the relationship, so that, a young adult can live separately and a 6-year-old cries when they go to camp. And individuation pertains to the psychological differentiation, which means I am not necessarily exactly like you. I don't necessarily feel or think like you in every way, but but I am in connection with you. So the capacity to sort of form our own autonomous, individuated sense of who we are while maintaining an emotional positive connection to someone else, that's individuation. And we had somewhat of a difficult process achieving that level, which means that and that was very much related to the issue that we know in the literature about the second generation. We were in many ways imbued, or we perceived special missions that are not the normative missions in families where there isn't parental trauma. We felt a special obligation to protect our parents. We felt a special obligation to not cause them any additional anxiety. And as we now all know as parents, it's very difficult to raise children without being able to absorb certain levels of anxiety, because the children need to do all kinds of things that normatively most parents can tolerate better. Trauma survivors may have a lot more anxiety around it. We had also all kinds of perceived obligations to succeed, to bring intense anachat and positive experiences to parents who lost everything, to live up to everything that the parents couldn't achieve because it was taken away from them. All of those things complicated our ability to separate and individuate, because separating and individuating from parents is a process that by nature causes parents some heartache. And we could not so easily afford to do that to our parents. So what we see in the second generation in us is that we have a sensitivity to stress reactions. We have more post-traumatic stress disorder in our own lives, even though we don't have a higher frequency of traumatic events, which means that we have a much more severe reaction, stress reaction to stressful events that other people also feel are stressful, but not quite as traumatic as we experience them to be. We have more robust PTSD, which was seen in combat veterans of the Israeli military. If they developed PTSD, their PTSD was much more resistant and robust. And when we face life-threatening situations, such as a serious life-threatening illness or the threat of nuclear destruction in Israel a few years ago, we have a much more catastrophic reaction to that than other people. And we also, by the way, do not share very important things like a diagnosis of a serious illness or something like that with parents if the survivor parents are still alive, because of this very profound internalized sense of having to protect the parents, which other people actually don't do. So if we look at a study that compared women with breast cancer diagnosis of the same phase of the illness, those of them who had survivor mothers uh, actually felt more distress when their mothers knew about the illness because of the worry that it caused the mothers, whereas the other ones who are not daughters of survivors found support in the relationship with their mothers. So it's a very important aspect that not only do we protect our parents, but in many ways, it is something that prevented us during growing up and even in those crises in adulthood. It prevented us from accessing support from our parents. And what we also see in some studies is that it is something that we take with us to other relationships, which might also prevent us from accessing support from spouses when necessary. And that we'll talk more about in another of our meetings. Now, the fear and anxiety are all very adaptive emotions. They actually signal a danger and triggers, fear triggers the reaction of fight or flight, and that's very adaptive. And anxiety also has a purpose. It serves as a motivator or an engine that moves us to take appropriate action to prepare ourselves and to protect ourselves. For example, during COVID, we have to, if we're anxious enough, we will wear a mask and wash our hands and keep social distancing. But it's really important to have the ability to experience anxiety only within what we call the window of tolerance. So we need enough anxiety to do those things that will protect us, but not too much anxiety that totally disrupts our functioning and can paralyze us. So for that reason, it's very good and very important for all of us to become aware of what are triggers for our anxiety and learn ways to self-modulate and regulate and down-regulate our anxiety as soon as it starts. Because once it starts rolling, it sort of gets a life of its own and it's very hard to stop it. And part of what the purpose of these conversations are is to make us aware of our vulnerabilities, such as our vulnerability to anxiety, become aware of who are the people that make you feel more anxious when you talk to them. Maybe you shouldn't listen to this TV program or that TV program. Maybe you should listen to just less of the news. Maybe you should, who makes you feel better, who makes you feel anxious, what makes you feel anxious, how to monitor it, how to regulate it, and how to learn to do things that help you reduce your level of anxiety once you started coming on. So of course, we'll talk about epigenetic findings, I'm sure a little bit more, but what we know is part of our vulnerability is due to potential changes in the way that our DNA manifests itself. So we may have changes in the way that our DNA shows itself or acts due to the conditions that our parents lived through. So for example, there is a hypothesis which is fairly well supported by quite a bit of studies that when parents live through a period of prolonged starvation, certain parts of the DNA get changed in a sense that not the DNA gets changed, but its manifestation, its myelination, and therefore it's the way that it actually acts. And therefore we have that change, we inherit that change that is supposed to protect us for against starvation, so that our bodies will be able to hang on to nutrients better. But since we don't live under conditions of starvation, it might be one of the reasons why when we reach middle age, second generation show a higher prevalence of pre-diabetic and diabetic conditions. So it's really, I think I found it very helpful, since I am not a neurologist or a geneticist or a biologist. For me, the way to think about it was very helpful when someone said, think about epigenetic changes as your DNA is a piano. The piano doesn't change, it's the same piano. But epigenetic changes essentially are similar to someone coming and taping down some of the keys of this piano, so that now the same piano plays a different music. And that's the way that epigenetic changes influence the manifestation of our DNA. And some of those changes have to do with those biological, medical, elevated risks, as I said, and to the stress changes in our stress reaction, in the hormones and in the neuropeptides that are associated with the type of stress reaction in our brain. And what we see in very high quality meta-analytic studies, which are studies that have a very sophisticated statistical way of combining many studies and the findings of many studies and concocting something that shows us what all of them together show. So meta-analytic studies show us that both in civilian populations and in non-civilian, in combat population and in non-combat populations, what is really very important is the parental level of post-traumatic stress disorders, as I said, and that is something that's very much associated with symptoms in the children. And I wanted to add here that in specifically related to COVID-19, my colleague Amit Shrira from Bar-Ilan University, Professor Amit Shrira, and I just completed a study of the second generation's reaction to COVID-19. And our findings were very interesting, in my opinion. They were very consistent with everything I told you so far, which is that those of us who report a description of their parents, at least one parent, as having had post-traumatic stress disorder. And that is something that we just ask people about all kinds of symptoms and they describe their parents, and we see if that is something that is consistent with PTSD or not. Those of us who describe at least one parent as having had a significant level of those symptoms were different from those of us who had both parents that they described as not suffering from any significant levels of PTSD and from the control subjects. And how were those with parental PTSD different? They had greater levels of psychological distress, including a higher level of anxiety and a higher level of depressive symptoms. And another thing that was very interesting was that those with parental PTSD felt much more lonely, even though they did not have any lesser social support around them than the other people. So having a parent with post-traumatic symptoms was associated with simply having a higher subjective sense of loneliness during COVID. And the interesting thing is that none of our 2Gs, none of our second generation actually showed higher levels of, none of the groups of 2Gs showed a higher level of worries that were specifically related to COVID-19, to catching the illness or someone close catching the illness. The worries that were expressed were much more related to what we consider sort of a hostile worldview. It was more about what is happening around COVID, the scarcity initially in the stores, the rise in gun sales. What does it mean? What might people do if there will be scarcity? What might people do around the elections? All of those worries about, as some people said, we know how neighbors can become murderers, and all of those worries about things much wider than the actual worry about the illness itself. Those things were what the second generation expressed. As this poem is very, very beautiful, I would like to share that with you. It's a poem by Janice Freebaum, who I understand lives with many of you in Florida. And it's a beautiful depiction, I think, of the second generation experience. So I would like to share it with you quickly. I know I have to stop in every minute. In fact, I should have stopped 3 minutes ago, but I'll share it with you anyway. You were mute to free our spirits. You kept secrets to spare us grief. Yet we were tethered to your pain and mourned for your losses. How could you know your eyes spoke volumes and your silence painted pictures? In perfect step we moved, not too close, not too much. If you think we didn't care, we thought you didn't either. If you thought we didn't need your burden, we thought we wouldn't bother you with ours. You thought, we thought, you assumed, and so did we, all to keep us safe, all to keep you unhurt. And I wanted to mention just a couple more points and then I will stop. And that is that even within the same family, children have different susceptibility to everything, to parental pain, to parental symptoms, also to parental resiliencies, and also to factors that lie outside the family, both protective factors and risk factors in the environment around the family. So that even within the same family, two children of the same survivor parents may have very different outcomes, may seem to have dealt with their Holocaust legacy very differently. We have a tremendous variability amongst us, but I think we definitely all share a very meaningful legacy, each of us in their own way. And it seems that in this particular time of COVID, a lot of us feel the need to congregate amongst ourselves and share experiences amongst ourselves, because even when our experiences are very different and our feelings about it are very different, we all feel very, very much how it's related to something that other people cannot understand. I will stop here. Thank you very much. You're muted, Jenny.
You saw me applaud though, and I was saying, thank you so much, Dr. Felsen. You leave us with so much to think about every time you present. Um, we do have a few questions and some comments as well, but I'm going to ask you a couple of the questions first and then make some comments of what people have said and then see if you could respond.
Sure.
Um,
And if we have some extra time, then I still have a few slides that I could go back to.
okay, thank you. So one of the questions was, is there a difference in secondary trauma in children whose survivor parents did not share their experiences as opposed to those who may have heard directly about their parents' experiences?
Yeah, so that's really a very interesting question. And what we see is that it is more about how the parent shared or how the parent was silent rather than whether they were silent or shared. Meaning, many times it's the parent who was actually very post-traumatic who couldn't talk about the Holocaust at all, and then the child sensed this ominous, enormously ominous presence of terrible things that they couldn't even know anything about, and that was damaging. And sometimes it was the parent who was post-traumatic who couldn't stop talking about the Holocaust and talked about the Holocaust breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and in ways that were totally inappropriate for the developmental level of the child or how much the child could take at a certain point. So what we see is that in some studies that looked at that specifically was that the people who spoke about the Holocaust, but spoke about it not too much and not too little, those children were less negatively impacted than the people in the extremes, because the people in the extremes were most likely the people with more severe post-traumatic symptoms and less ability to control and modulate the amount and the way in which they talked about it, so that it would be appropriate for where the child was at a given time.
Thank you. Um, Could you talk a little bit more about the numbing that you describe, and specifically what that numbing effect may have long term on health?
Yes. So, yeah. So the numbing is the inability to feel, the inability to allow oneself to feel, which some people, there are some studies that show an amazing capacity among some people to actually, some survivors, to uh, repress and keep in under a lid negative feelings and yet be able to feel joyful feelings. But in general, it's much more common in people with trauma histories that when they have to put a lid on the capacity to feel very terrible feelings, it often also constricts their ability to feel spontaneous, joyful feelings at a strong enough level. Everything kind of gets a little bit muted. Everything gets a little bit sort of colorless. So a good example of numbing would be a story that I love telling of my patient who said to me, I don't understand it. She said, I live the American dream life. I have a beautiful house with a picket fence in the suburbs in New Jersey. I have a good family, a good marriage. I said to my parents who lived in New York, I'll come to you, I'll take you in my car, I'll bring you to my house for the holiday or for a weekend, and we'll have a good time. I'll bring you back home. They say to me, I don't know. We'll see. I don't feel so well. Your mom doesn't feel so well. We're tired. We don't know. We'll see. My sister lives on Long Island. She is very, distressed. She has a terrible marriage. There are lots of tourists there. The same parents of ours can get on the bus with pots of cooked food, schlep themselves all the way to Long Island. For that, they have the strength. What does it mean? It's not that they didn't love their daughters in the same way, but that being able to relax, to enjoy, to take in the naches and the good experience was something that was difficult, much more difficult. Whereas the call to rescue their daughter, the call to activate the same sort of mechanisms of coping and of resilience that help them, deal with this with all the other difficulties that they had to deal with, that was easier. Or to hear from a patient that when she told her mother that she was pregnant, it's the quote that I read to you from the book by Maria Russell Doria, right? The inability to hear your mother's joy when you tell her that you graduated first in your class, or that you're pregnant, or these things kind of were like, okay, yeah, great, that's very nice. Whereas the sad things, the worries, the terrible things get much more of a reaction. So the numbing is such that a child can feel that whatever they do and however good they try to be and whatever good they try to bring is muted and minimized and not good enough. And that's very impactful in terms of the relationship and one's sense of self. In terms of health, it has a specific impact on our own health, because there is a study that showed from Israel that showed actually that when second generation reached middle age, they actually reported good, feeling good psychologically, and yet they reported a higher level of objective measures of difficult health issues, health problems. And one of the explanations was that a little bit of that repressive coping that allows one not to feel is part of what makes us not feel signs of a problem, of a physical problem, and push it aside and not pay attention and not feel it and not go to the doctor until the problem becomes much bigger. Whereas somebody else, it hurts them, or something feels weird, they go to the doctor. You know, uh, I have a patient who had an ectopic pregnancy, but she was told that's it's wait and see, and we'll see. And she waited until it burst open. She was able to suffer all that pain because we're tough. We don't have to make a big deal of small things. So numbing and being a little bit out of touch with one's own feelings can have a detrimental effect on our ability to actually take care of ourselves, especially as we age.
Thank you. And we were talking about health, and one of the questions was whether there may be any kind of connection or prevalence of immune kinds of disorders, such as autoimmune diseases, fibromyalgia, in second generation survivors, if there's any
I cannot
prevalence.
speak with real authority on that. I did not actually come across specific findings related to that. I can say that we know from the survivor generation that PTSD from the survivor generation, as well as other populations of people with PTSD, that it's related to basically every possible illness you can think of, including those.
Thank you, Dr. Felsen. There's a question about the reaction of second generation to end of life issues, end of life stages, and their parents, and wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, so, that's a very big question. And in fact, if you would like, I actually gave a 6-part seminar specifically about that for Metro Jewish Health System. And it's on their website, I believe, still. It's very complicated. And studies show us that some survivors can be perceived as very difficult patients, especially survivors with PTSD, as are also veterans with PTSD. And we see that second generation, with this imbued with this incredibly deep sense of obligation to protect our parents, we have a very hard time tolerating our parents, in distress, our parents' pain. We have a very hard time with care that doesn't seem to be empathic enough, immediate enough. Physicians, nurses that don't seem to understand how important it is to provide an extra level of empathy and an extra level of immediacy in alleviating survivors' distress, because these are people who have gone through so much and who have suffered such a profound lack of empathy from other people that it's truly impossible for us to accept that they should be in any way victims of it again. So it creates for a lot of pain in the second generation, and a lot of difficulties in the relationship between the second generation and healthcare providers of the parents. And so it is truly my mission, having gone through it myself with my own mother, and having seen how difficult it can be sometimes in hospitals, and for staff who don't know anything about trauma and about what survivors went through. It became a mission of mine to speak to healthcare providers, physicians, hospital staff, long-term care facility staff, to educate them about it and about the experiences. Why are children of survivors perceived as such difficult families? Why are some survivors perceived as such difficult, demanding patients? How is it related to not just them being just such unpleasant people, but what happened to them and what they've lived through already?
Thank you. And for the last question, I want to kind of,
Can I go back to that for 1 second, Jenny?
please.
I also wanted to add another little thing here, and that is that studies show us that the second generation as caregivers have a lot of issues that we need to be aware of. One of them is that because of that degree of intense loyalty to the parents, an intense sense of filial obligation, and also sometimes because of the mistrust of others, sometimes the second generation become caregivers and have a really hard time asking for assistance or accepting assistance from other people. And that actually works against the quality of care sometimes that they are able to provide their parents, and against their own, their own health, because they get burnt out, they get overburdened, they get depressed, they get ill, they neglect their own health. It doesn't do good to anybody. And we have to be able to help second generation that we know strike some kind of a balance between being good caretakers and at the same time not having to do everything by themselves to the point that the whole system collapses actually.
So there was a quick question about the Metro West JFS website. Do you know where specifically it is on the website?
I will check and put it on my blog.
Okay, thank you. The last question I want to put in that we can take, there are many more, but one of the last ones, I just want to put in the context of this today really spoke to the anxiety and some of the depression and post-traumatic experiences of Holocaust families. We also have you talk about the unique strengths of second generation and Holocaust families and really focus on resilience. And then
Yes.
obviously there's third generation. So one of the comments was about your research, and you made a comment at the beginning, Dr. Felsen, saying that you didn't include all of the references, but there was a question about how large were these studies and where does this sort of information come from? And I wonder if you could just maybe,
Sure.
give some
So
comment to the sort of exception that the comment was specifically making, that my peers aren't feeling these kinds of experiences and don't have this sort of experience.
yes. So first of all, with regards to the study that I mentioned about COVID and the reactions during COVID time, we had a sample that is considered a decent size sample of 300 people. So um, uh, about uh, about 200, let me see, 245 2G, and about 50 controls. That was for that particular study, which allows for a decent, statistical analysis within those groups of the 2Gs. We had the ones with two parents with PTSD, with one parent with PTSD, and no PTSD, no parental PTSD, and the control group. So about 50 people in each. Sorry, more than 50 people in each. We had a total of 300 people. That's for that particular study. As opposed, other studies, I don't know which one to relate to,
Well,
but
I think it was a general statement when you were talking about sort of the negative aspects of
yes.
experiencing
So
parents who
yes, I will emphasize that indeed, even in our study, there was a group of 2Gs who did not perceive their parents as having had a significant amount of persistent post-traumatic symptoms, and they were no different than the controls. They did not have these feelings. It's the people who perceive their parents, at least one of them, as having a sufficient amount of the symptoms that we ask them about, which constitute the disorder of PTSD. Those people were different from the other ones.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have run out of time. There are many other questions. I hope that people who are attending this will join us for other sessions, and a lot of the sort of topics do overlap a little bit. And so that may be an opportunity to get a question answered as well. Dr. Felsen, thank you so very, very, very much. And those of you who have attended this webinar, thank you. We look forward to seeing you at other webinars. They go through the end of February. And just to date this one, I wish everybody a happy and a healthy, safe Thanksgiving. All the best. And Dr. Felsen, kolakavod, and thank you so very much.
Thank you
Good.
very much, Dr. Frumer. I
Thank,
appreciate it. And thank you, everybody. Be well, be safe, and happy Thanksgiving.
thank you so much. And this concludes our webinar for this evening. Thank you for joining us. Good night.
Good night.